Hello, and welcome to Pages of Resilience, the podcast where we explore the lives of authors who didn't just write about the human condition, they lived it, often in the most brutal ways imaginable. I'm your host, Alexa.
And I'm Sam. Today, we're delving into one of the most intense, psychologically profound, and tragically fascinating figures in all of literature, Fyodor Dostoevsky.
The name itself carries weight, doesn't it? Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, The Idiot. These aren't just books. They are deep, dark, and dazzling excavations of the human soul.
They are, and what we'll discover today is that you cannot separate the books from the man. Dostoevsky's fiction is a direct transfusion of his own trauma, his despair, his faith, and his hard-won hope. His life was, in many ways, more dramatic than any of his plots.
It truly was. We're talking about a man who faced a firing squad, spent 4 years in a Siberian prison camp, battled epilepsy and a gambling addiction, and lived under the shadow of debt and death for most of his life. And yet, from that cauldron of suffering, he produced some of the most celebrated novels ever written.
So, in this episode, we're going to walk the path that he walked. We'll start at the most pivotal, terrifying moment of his life. A cold morning in St. Petersburg, where he was convinced he had only minutes left to live. This is the story of Fyodor Dostoevsky. Let's begin.
Part 1. The Execution and Its Aftermath. St. Petersburg, Russia, December 22nd, 1849, just before dawn. A 28-year-old Fyodor Dostoevsky is led from his cell along with several other members of a radical intellectual group known as the Petrushevsky Circle.
They're charged with reading and distributing banned literature, specifically works that criticized the Tsar and the institution of serfdom. For the authoritarian regime of Nicholas I, this was a direct threat.
They're taken to Semyonov Square. The air is frigid. They can see their breath, little puffs of life in the gray morning light. They are made to stand before a line of soldiers. A priest is present, holding a cross for their final rites.
Imagine the scene, Alexa. The fear must have been paralyzing. These are young men, intellectuals, writers, dreamers of a better Russia, and now they're staring down the barrels of rifles.
Dostoevsky later wrote about this moment with searing clarity. He described how he calculated the exact minutes he had left to live, how his mind raced trying to comprehend the concept of eternity, of simply not being.
He turned to his friend, Nikolai Speshnev, and said, "We shall be with Christ." To which Speshnev, a skeptic, replied grimly, "A handful of dust."
The order is given. The soldiers raise their rifles. The prisoners are blindfolded. Dostoevsky braces for the volley, for the impact, for the end. He hears the command, ready, aim, and then silence. A sudden, inexplicable halt. A drum roll breaks the tension. Not a death roll, but a retreat. An imperial adjutant gallops onto the square, waving a paper, a messenger from the Tsar.
It was a last-second pardon. Their sentences were commuted. But here's the cruel twist, the psychological torture that would define this event. The entire execution was a sham, a meticulously staged mock execution designed by the Tsar to break their spirits and teach them a lesson in absolute power.
Can we even fathom the emotional whiplash? To have your life utterly taken from you, to make peace with oblivion, only to have it handed back in a moment of grotesque theatricality? One of the prisoners, Grigoriev, went permanently insane on the spot.
For Dostoevsky, it was a rebirth, but a traumatic one. He wrote to his brother Mikhail later that day, "I was today in the grip of death for a quarter of an hour. I lived through that last moment in which everything was concentrated, and I felt now that God has given me life anew. It is a new life that is beginning. I am reborn in a new form."
But this new form wasn't freedom. The pardon came with a sentence of 4 years of hard labor in a Siberian prison camp in Omsk. followed by indefinite service as a common soldier. He was shackled and began the long, brutal journey east.
So, this is our starting point. A man who has literally stared into the abyss. But this wasn't the first time darkness had touched his life. To understand the man on that square, we have to go back. We have to look at the boy he once was and the series of losses that first opened his eyes to the suffering of the world. The stage for his entire philosophy was set long before he ever stood before that firing squad.
Part 2. Early Life and Traumatic Losses.
Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky was born in 1821 in Moscow. His father, Mikhail, was a stern, irritable, and deeply insecure army doctor who had worked his way up from poverty. He was a man of violent temper, and the household was often a tense one.
His mother, Maria, by all accounts, was the opposite. Kind, gentle, and cultured. It was from her that the young Fyodor received his early education, reading fairy tales, poetry, and from the Bible, specifically the Book of Job, a story that would resonate throughout his entire life.
The first major crack in his world came when he was 15. His mother, long suffering from tuberculosis, passed away. This was a devastating blow. The primary source of warmth and comfort in his life was gone.
And this loss set in motion an even more traumatic chain of events. His father, now a widower, retired from his medical practice and withdrew with his younger children to a small estate he owned in the countryside, a place called Darovoy.
Mikhail Dostoevsky descended further into alcoholism and paranoia. He became monstrously cruel to his serfs, the peasants who were legally bound to his land. The stories are horrific. He was known for his drunken rages and his excessive demands.
Then in 1839, Fyodor, who was away at a military engineering academy in St. Petersburg, received the news. His father was dead. The official story was that he died from a stroke, but the widespread rumor, the one that Fyodor believed for the rest of his life, was that he was murdered by his own serfs.
The story goes that they held him down and forced vodka down his throat until he drowned. It was an act of brutal, vengeful justice.
Now let's pause here. Sam, what does this do to a young man's psyche? Your mother, your source of love, is taken by illness. Your father, a figure of fear and authority, is murdered by the very people he oppressed. The world is suddenly a place of random, cruel fate and violent human retribution.
It's the foundation of everything. It instilled in him a profound and lasting bitterness, but also a deep, complicated empathy. He understood the oppressed because he saw his father's tyranny, and he understood the capacity for violence because he saw it in the serfs' rebellion. He was trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither.
And there's another often overlooked childhood trauma. When he was about 9, while wandering in the woods near his father's estate, he came across the body of a young girl who had been brutally raped and murdered. The shock of this discovery, this sudden violent intrusion of evil into his childhood, haunted him forever.
So by the time he was 18, he had experienced the death of a beloved parent from disease, the violent murder of a hated parent, and had witnessed the aftermath of a gruesome, senseless crime. This is the raw material. This is the well from which he would draw for the rest of his career. The themes of patricide, guilt, innocence, and the problem of evil in a world created by God, these weren't academic questions for him. They were the ghosts of his youth. With this heavy psychological baggage, he tried to forge himself a path. He was miserable at the engineering academy, dreaming only of literature. And as soon as he could, he resigned his commission and threw himself into the turbulent literary world of St. Petersburg, a decision that would lead him to his first taste of fame and then straight into the hands of the Tsar's executioners.
Part 3. Career Beginnings and Imprisonment. So it's the early 1840s. Dostoevsky is in his early 20s, adrift in St. Petersburg, desperately poor, but burning with a desire to write. He translates Balzac to make ends meet, but he's working on something of his own.
That something was Poor Folk, his first novel. It's an epistolary novel told through letters between a poor, aging clerk and a young seamstress. It's a story of humble, tragic lives, full of compassion for the downtrodden.
He gave the manuscript to his friend, Dmitry Grigorovich, who, in one of the great moments of literary history, took it straight to the most influential poet and critic of the day, Vissarion Belinsky. Legend has it that Grigorovich burst into Belinsky's apartment in the middle of the night, shouting, "A new Gogol has appeared."
Belinsky read it and was utterly captivated. He summoned the young, trembling Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky later recalled the moment.
He spoke with feverish intensity, his eyes flashing. "Do you understand?" he shouted at me. "Do you understand yourself what you have written? You have written a work of genius."
Overnight, Fyodor Dostoevsky became a literary sensation. He was hailed as the great new voice of Russian realism. He was thrust into the highest literary circles, and frankly, his head swelled. He became arrogant, difficult, and prone to histrionics.
But fame is fickle. His immediate follow-up works, like The Double, a brilliant but bizarre story of a man haunted by his doppelganger, were met with confusion and harsh criticism. Belinsky and his circle turned on him. The genius was now a has-been in the space of just a couple of years.
This rejection was a crushing blow. He felt isolated, humiliated, and his financial situation became desperate again. It was in this vulnerable, searching state that he began attending the meetings of the Petrushevsky Circle.
We have to be clear about this group, Sam. This wasn't a cell of bomb-throwing revolutionaries. It was a loose gathering of intellectuals, artists, and civil servants who met to discuss Western ideas, utopian socialism, philosophy, and political reforms. They dreamed of a Russia without serfdom, with freedom of speech.
But in the eyes of Tsar Nicholas I, this was pure sedition. The state surveillance apparatus, a precursor to the KGB, had infiltrated the group. In the spring of 1849, the police moved in. Dostoevsky and dozens of others were arrested and thrown into the Peter and Paul Fortress, the notorious political prison.
He spent 8 months in solitary confinement, not knowing his fate. He was interrogated, he held out hope, and then he was sentenced to death, which brings us full circle to Semyonov Square and the mock execution.
So his literary career began with a meteoritic rise, a painful fall, and then was violently interrupted by the state. The writer was now a convict. The journey to Siberia was not just a physical one. It was a descent into a new and perhaps the most important layer of his education.
The intellectual in the salons of St. Petersburg was about to be erased and reborn in the mud and filth of a Siberian prison camp. Part 4. Life in Exile and Relationships.
The Omsk prison fortress was hell on earth. Dostoevsky described it in his semi-autobiographical work, Notes from the House of the Dead. He was shackled, the air was thick with the stench of filth and sweat. He slept on a bare plank and was surrounded by murderers, thieves, and violent criminals who despised him as a gentleman, an intellectual.
He had no privacy, no peace. His books were taken away. His only book was the New Testament, which a group of Decemberist wives, women who had followed their own exiled husbands to Siberia, gave him. He read it obsessively.
And it was here that his epilepsy, which may have had earlier minor manifestations, erupted into full-blown violent seizures. The prison doctors were useless. His fellow inmates were either frightened or scornful.
But this is also where his transformation truly solidified. He was forced to look at these criminals not as abstractions, but as human beings. He discovered a hidden dignity, a complexity, a capacity for goodness even in the most seemingly irredeemable souls. He wrote, "In every man a spark of God is hidden."
After 4 years of this unthinkable hardship, his prison term ended in 1854, but he wasn't free. He was compelled to enlist as a common soldier in the Siberian Army Corps, stationed in the remote town of Semipalatinsk.
This was a form of internal exile. It was here that he experienced his first real love. He met and fell for Maria Dmitrievna Isayeva, the wife of a local official. She was intelligent, passionate, and unhappy. It was a tumultuous, painful affair. Her husband died, leaving her in poverty, and after a period of agonizing uncertainty, she and Dostoevsky married in 1857.
But this was not a happy union. Maria was frail, consumptive, and emotionally volatile. The marriage was plagued by jealousy, financial worry, and her deteriorating health. It was a relationship born of desperation more than pure love.
Finally, in 1859, after nearly a decade in exile, Dostoevsky was allowed to return to European Russia. He settled back in St. Petersburg with Maria, who was now critically ill. He threw himself back into writing and journalism, co-editing a magazine, Time, with his brother Mikhail.
And then another series of hammer blows. His wife, Maria, died in 1864. His beloved brother and literary partner, Mikhail, died just 3 months later. He was left utterly alone, drowning in grief and now in his brother's debts. To cope, he did the worst thing possible. He turned to gambling. He developed a ruinous obsession with roulette, traveling to European spas and losing every ruble he could get his hands on. He was in a downward spiral of despair, guilt, and addiction.
It was in this desperate state that he made a fateful decision. He signed a predatory contract with a publisher, Fyodor Dostoevsky. The terms were brutal. He had to deliver a new full-length novel by a certain date. If he failed, Dostoevsky would own the rights to all of his past and future works for the next 9 years. Of course, Dostoevsky procrastinated. He traveled, he gambled, he despaired. With only months left, he realized he was doomed. Friends suggested he hire a stenographer to dictate the novel faster, and that is how Anna Grigorievna Snipkina entered his life.
Anna was a young, efficient, and remarkably intelligent and stable woman of 20. Dostoevsky, by contrast, was a 45-year-old, epileptic, grief-stricken, gambling addict wreck. He dictated to her a short novel called The Gambler, a work drawn directly from his own torment.
Against all odds, they finished it. The legend says they delivered the manuscript to Dostoevsky on the final day as the deadline was expiring. But more importantly, in the process, they fell in love.
This relationship was the turning point of his life. Anna Grigorievna was not a passionate, turbulent soul like his first wife. She was a practical, devoted, and fiercely loyal partner. She took over his chaotic finances, negotiated with his creditors, and gave him the emotional stability he had never known.
She was, in every sense, his savior. They married and would remain together for the rest of his life. With Anna by his side, Dostoevsky entered his most productive and brilliant period. He was finally ready to synthesize all his suffering, all his thought, all his faiths and doubts into his great masterpieces.
Part 5. Final Works and Legacy. The period following his marriage to Anna is simply staggering. In rapid succession, he produced what are known as his 5 great novels: Crime and Punishment, 1866, The Idiot, 1869, Demons, 1872, The Adolescent, 1875, and the monumental The Brothers Karamazov, 1880.
Let's just take a moment on a few of these. Crime and Punishment is the ultimate psychological thriller. A student, Raskolnikov, believing himself to be a superman beyond conventional morality, murders a pawnbroker. The novel is not about the crime, but the punishment, the psychological, spiritual disintegration that follows.
And it's filled with the ghosts of his life: the poverty, the cramped St. Petersburg apartments, the intellectual arrogance that mirrors his own youthful hubris, and the possibility of redemption through suffering and love, symbolized by the saintly prostitute Sonia.
Then there's The Idiot, his attempt to portray a positively good man, Prince Myshkin, a Christ-like figure who is too pure, too innocent for the corrupt, cynical world. He is destroyed by it. It's a heartbreaking novel that asks, is genuine goodness even possible in this world?
And finally, the capstone of his career, The Brothers Karamazov. It's a family saga, a murder mystery, a courtroom drama, and the deepest philosophical and theological exploration ever put into a novel. The 3 brothers, Alyosha the believer, Ivan the intellectual atheist, and Dmitri the passionate sensualist, represent the warring parts of Dostoevsky's own soul.
The centerpiece of the novel is Ivan's Grand Inquisitor parable, a blistering attack on the church and a profound exploration of freedom, happiness, and the problem of evil. It remains one of the most discussed chapters in all of world literature.
He was working on the sequel to Karamazov. He was at the peak of his fame, revered as a national prophet. And then, in January 1881, he suffered a pulmonary hemorrhage. It was related to his emphysema.
The end came quickly. On his deathbed, he asked Anna to read to him the parable of the prodigal son from the Gospel of St. Luke. The book that had been his solace in prison was now his comfort in death. He died on January 28, 1881, at the age of 59.
His funeral was a national event. Tens of thousands of people poured into the streets to follow his coffin. He was buried in the Tikveni cemetery, a man who had known the depths of despair and had somehow channeled it into a legacy of unparalleled insight.
So, Sam, after walking through this incredible, almost novelistic life, what is the final takeaway? What is the core of the Dostoevsky legacy?
I think it's this. Dostoevsky forces us to look into the abyss of human existence, the suffering, the doubt, the violence, the injustice, and he doesn't let us look away. He stares into it with unblinking honesty.
But he doesn't leave us there in the darkness.
Exactly. He shows us that within that very suffering, within that struggle, is where meaning is forged. That faith is not the absence of doubt, but the struggle with it. That redemption is possible not in spite of our suffering, but through it. He affirms the incredible, irrational, and resilient power of the human spirit to love, to hope, and to believe, even when all evidence points to despair.
His characters are not heroes or villains. They're complex, contradictory, and deeply human. They are us at our best and our worst. And by walking with them through their torments, we understand ourselves a little better.
He once wrote, "What is hell? I maintain that it is the suffering of being unable to love." His entire life and work were a long, painful, but ultimately triumphant journey out of that hell and into the difficult, messy, but beautiful world of human connection.
His story is a testament to the idea that our deepest wounds can become the source of our greatest strength, and that art can be the crucible where that transformation takes place.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of Fyodor Dostoevsky. If this conversation sparked your interest, we highly encourage you to pick up one of his books. Maybe start with Crime and Punishment. It's a challenging but unforgettable ride.
And for our listeners, we'd love to hear from you. Which author's life of resilience would you like us to explore next? Find us on social media and let us know.
Until next time, keep turning the page.